We called it the turning. It wasn't a single event, not one final explosion or a tidal wave that swallowed the last coast. It was a slow, agonizing fade to gray. From the viewport of the Anka, Earth didn't look like a disaster zone. It looked like a memory, a beautiful, swirling marble of blue and white, deceptively peaceful. But we knew the truth. The blue was thinning, the white clouds were tinged with the dust of 1,000 dead cities, and the green patches we remembered from old pictures were now just smudges of brown. Every soul on this ship, all 10,000 of us, had a window schedule. We'd line up, wait our turn, and just stare at our dying home, trying to burn the image into our minds before it disappeared forever. The silence in the observation deck was always the heaviest thing on the ship, heavier than the hull, heavier than the fuel tanks. It was a silence filled with unspoken goodbyes. Goodbye to rain on a tin roof, goodbye to the smell of wet soil after a storm, goodbye to the taste of an apple picked from a tree. We were the lucky ones, they told us, the chosen few who got a ticket to the future. But as I watched Earth shrink, becoming just another star in the black, a profound sense of guilt washed over me. We weren't just leaving a planet. We were abandoning a graveyard filled with everyone we had ever lost, every ancestor who had ever lived. We were the last chapter of a book, and we had just torn ourselves from the binding. Commander Eva Rostova stood near the main viewport, her reflection a ghostly figure against the receding planet. She never scheduled a time, she just appeared, her presence a quiet anchor for the rest of us. She didn't look sad, not in the way we were. Her expression was one of immense, soul-crushing responsibility. She was the one who had to make this all work. She was carrying the weight of humanity's continuation on her shoulders, and you could see it in the lines around her eyes. She wasn't just watching a planet die. She was watching the place where her mission began, the place she could never, ever return to. The finality of it was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left you breathless. My turn at the window came. I pressed my palm against the cold, thick glass, half expecting to feel something, some connection to the 7 billion ghosts I was leaving behind. There was nothing, just cold, engineered plasteel between me and the past. The blue sphere was now the size of my thumbnail. Soon it would be gone, and all we would have left were the digital pictures, the carefully curated videos, and the aching hollow space in our hearts. We were astronauts, pioneers, saviors of the species, but in that moment, we were just orphans, staring out into the infinite darkness, unmoored and utterly, terrifyingly alone. The journey had begun. We were on our way to Mars. The Anka was not built for comfort. It was a brute force solution to an impossible problem. Imagine a city block, extruded into a long cylinder, and then strapped to the most powerful engines humanity could cobble together from the scraps of a dying world. That was our home. It was a maze of grey corridors, humming with the constant, low thrum of life support systems. Every surface was cold, metallic, and practical. There were no decorations, no unnecessary flourishes. Space and mass were luxuries we couldn't afford. Our living quarters were pods, barely big enough for a bunk and a small screen. We were living inside a machine, a giant, complex, and sometimes frighteningly fragile machine. Our lives were dictated by the ship's rhythm. The hum of the CO2 scrubbers was our morning bird song. The rumble of the fusion drive cycling up for a course correction was our thunderstorm. We learned the ship's language, the creak that meant a thermal contraction in the outer hull, the shudder that signaled the recycling pumps kicking in. We were the ship's blood cells, flowing through its metallic arteries, performing the endless tasks required to keep the great beast alive. We were engineers, doctors, botanists, and technicians. Every single one of us had a critical job. If one person failed, a system could fail. If a system failed, we all died. It was that simple. The ship was divided into zones, a necessity for containment but a catalyst for social friction. The engineers from the Eurasian bloc kept to the aft sections, near their precious engines. The botanists from the Americas tended the hydroponic bays in the central ring, a splash of vibrant green in a world of gray. We tried to maintain the illusion of a unified humanity, the crew of Anka, as the mission patches read. But old habits die hard. Accents, customs, and old-world grievances festered in the recycled air. You could feel the tension in the mess hall, the way groups sat apart, speaking in their native tongues. We had left Earth behind, but we had brought all of its baggage with us. The Anka was our ark, our savior, but it was also our prison. The same walls that protected us from the vacuum of space also confined us, trapping us with our memories and our fears. There was no escape. You couldn't go for a walk to clear your head. You couldn't see a new face. Every day was a loop of the same corridors, the same tasks, the same recycled air, and the same 10,000 people. It was a womb, yes, protecting the fragile infant of humanity's future. But it was a cold, unfeeling womb, and we were all desperate to be born into a new world, no matter how harsh it might be. Memories were a dangerous currency on the Anka. They could sustain you, but they could also break you. We all had our private collections, stored on data pads or just behind our eyes. A video of a child's birthday party, the sun bright, the grass green, the sound of waves crashing on a beach, a place that was now likely a toxic salt flat. The smell of frying bacon, a scent that no food synthesizer could ever truly replicate. These sensory ghosts haunted the corridors, whispered in the quiet of our sleeping pods, and sometimes ambushed us when we least expected it. A technician might see a flicker on a screen that reminded them of city lights, and suddenly they'd be lost for an hour, paralyzed by grief. We had a ship-wide network, the Archive, which held a curated library of Earth's culture, music, books, films. It was supposed to be a comfort, a way to carry our heritage with us. But often, it felt like a museum of the dead. Listening to Vivaldi's Four Seasons was an exercise in pain. Spring was a fantasy, summer a memory, autumn a ghost, and winter was now eternal. Watching old movies was worse. Seeing actors walk through bustling cities, breathing open air, taking the world for granted. It was like watching a fantasy film, but one we knew was real, and one we had lost forever. Some people avoided the Archive entirely, choosing a sterile present over a painful past. The children were different. Those born on the ship, or who were too young to remember Earth clearly, saw the Archive as pure fiction. To them, rain was a concept from a storybook, like a dragon or a magic spell. They would ask questions that broke our hearts. What did the sky feel like? Were there really animals that weren't in the biobank? We would try to explain, fumbling for words to describe things that were once so commonplace. How do you describe the feeling of wind on your face to someone who has only ever known recycled air? How do you explain the sheer, overwhelming scale of an ocean to someone whose entire world is a metal tube? We held memorial services, not for people, but for things. We had a day of the ocean, where we would watch videos of whales and coral reefs. We had a day of the forest, where the hydroponics bay would be opened for all, and we'd try to remember the smell of pine and damp earth. These rituals were meant to help us process our collective loss, to formalize our mourning, but they also sharpened the pain. They reminded us that we were survivors of a planetary extinction. We were living artifacts, the last beings to have known a blue sky. It was a heavy burden, a legacy of sorrow that we would carry with us to the red dust of Mars. Life aboard the Anka was a relentless grind, a masterclass in monotony governed by the unforgiving laws of physics and biology. Every day was structured around a simple, brutal goal, keeping 10,000 human bodies alive in a tin can, hurtling through a void. My job was in water reclamation, Sector Gamma 7. That's a fancy way of saying I managed the machines that turned our waste back into drinkable water. It wasn't glamorous. It involved a lot of monitoring gauges, running diagnostics, and replacing filters that smelled exactly as bad as you'd imagine. But it was essential. A single decimal point of error in the purification process could poison a whole sector. Every job was like that, a tightrope walk over a chasm of catastrophe. The food was another constant struggle. The hydroponics team, led by a stoic botanist named Dr. Eris Thorne, were treated like miracle workers. They coaxed life from nutrient gels under the harsh glare of full-spectrum LEDs. Potatoes, soy, algae, and a variety of leafy greens. That was our menu. Everything was processed into a nutrient-dense paste, sometimes flavored to vaguely resemble things like chicken or beef. We choked it down 3 times a day, dreaming of cheese, of chocolate, of anything with real texture. Food wasn't for pleasure. It was fuel. Rationing was strict, calculated down to the last calorie. A bad harvest in Bay 3 meant tighter rations for everyone, and the grumbling in the mess hall would grow a little louder. Repairs were a constant nagging worry. The Anchor was built with the best technology we had, but it was technology from a failing civilization, often rushed and built with scavenged parts. Something was always breaking. A faulty sensor on the outer hull required a dangerous EVA. A short circuit in a power conduit would plunge a corridor into darkness. A pump in the life support system would start making a new, worrying noise. Our engineers were heroes, patching the ship together with ingenuity and sheer willpower. They cannibalized non-essential systems, 3D-printed replacement parts, and spent their days covered in grease and coolant, staving off the slow, inevitable entropy that threatened to tear our world apart. The psychological toll of this routine was immense. We called it cycle fatigue. The same tasks, the same corridors, the same bland food day after day for months on end. Tempers frayed. Small disagreements over shared tools or mess hall seating could escalate into shouting matches. The ship's counselors were overworked, dealing with everything from profound depression to claustrophobic panic attacks. We had drills for fires and hull breaches, but there was no drill for the slow erosion of the human spirit. We were all just holding on, marking off the days on our data pads, praying that the routine would hold until we saw Mars. It started subtly. A cough in the mess hall, a few extra people reporting to the med bay with fevers they dismissed as cycle fatigue. In a closed system like the Anchor, with its perfectly recycled air and water, widespread illness was supposed to be impossible. We had been through months of quarantine before launch, but viruses are patient. They are masters of hiding, of waiting. This one, which the doctors eventually dubbed LV7, or Lethe virus, seemed to have a particular affinity for the respiratory system. It was a ghost from Earth, a final parting gift from our dying home, smuggled aboard in the lungs of an asymptomatic carrier. At first, Chief Medical Officer John Lee tried to keep it quiet. Panic was as dangerous as any pathogen on a crowded starship. She isolated the first few cases, running tests, trying to map the virus's genome. But it was too fast. It spread through the ventilation system, a system designed to keep us alive that was now delivering a potential death sentence. The coughs became more frequent. People started collapsing at their workstations. The medbay overflowed into an adjacent storage compartment, the low, pained groans of the sick becoming a new, terrifying part of the ship's ambient noise. The whispers of sickness turned into a roar of fear that echoed through every corridor. The virus was insidious. For most, it was a bad, week-long flu, but for about 1 in 10 of the infected, it attacked the nervous system, leading to disorientation, memory loss, and eventually respiratory failure. That's why they called it the Lethe virus, after the mythological river of forgetfulness. It didn't just steal your breath, it stole your memories of Earth, your reason for making this journey in the first place. The fear wasn't just of dying, but of fading away, of your mind being erased before your body gave out. We started wearing masks, avoiding contact, eyeing our neighbors with suspicion. The fragile community we had built began to fracture under the strain. Commander Rostova had to address the ship. Her face appeared on every screen, calm and steady, But her eyes couldn't hide the gravity of the situation. She announced a ship-wide lockdown. All non-essential personnel were confined to their pods. Only medical staff, engineers, and a skeleton crew for critical systems were allowed to move through the ship. The Anka, once a bustling hive of activity, became a ghost ship. The silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, mournful silence of the journey's beginning. It was a tense, fearful silence, punctuated by the sound of distant coughing and the hum of overworked medical equipment. We were a ship of ghosts, haunted by a plague from a dead world. The crisis reached its breaking point 2 weeks into the outbreak. Dr. Lee stood before Commander Rostova in the command center, her face pale and drawn. The data on the main screen was a stark, brutal set of lines and numbers. The virus was still spreading. The ship's main infirmary and the overflow bays were at capacity. Worse, the life support systems were being pushed to their absolute limit. The CO2 scrubbers and oxygen generators were designed for 10,000 healthy, resting humans. They were not designed to support hundreds of patients with compromised respiratory systems, many of whom required enriched oxygen just to stay alive. The equation was simple, and honestly horrifying. The Lethe virus isn't the primary threat anymore, Commander, Dr. Lee said, her voice trembling slightly. It's a cascade failure. The strain on the life support system is becoming critical. The atmospheric processors in the affected sectors are running at 130%. They will fail. Not might, they will. If they go down, the air will turn toxic for everyone on this ship, healthy or sick. The command center was silent. The bridge crew stared at their consoles, pretending to work, but everyone was listening. The choice was laid bare: save the sick and risk killing everyone, or make an impossible decision to save the ship itself. Rostova listened, her expression unreadable. She walked to the screen, tracing the red lines that showed the projected system failure. This was the kind of decision they trained for in simulations, a nightmare scenario you prayed would never happen. But this was real. These weren't variables on a screen. They were people, colleagues, friends, the last remnants of humanity. She turned to her chief engineer. Can you reroute power? Isolate the ventilation to the medical bays and let them run independently until their systems fail. The engineer nodded slowly. We can, but it would mean sealing them off. We would be cutting them off from the rest of the ship's life support. It would... He couldn't finish the sentence. It would be a death sentence, Dr. Lee whispered. The hardest decisions are never between good and bad. They are between bad and worse. Rostova stood in silence for a full minute, the weight of 10,000 lives and the future of the entire human species resting on her next words. Do it, she said, her voice low but firm. Isolate the medical bays. Reroute primary life support to the healthy sectors. Save the ship. A collective, silent gasp seemed to suck the air from the room. It was a cold, logical, and honestly monstrous choice. She was sacrificing nearly 1,000 souls to save the rest. She was amputating a limb to save the body. The order was given. The future of humanity would be built on a foundation of sacrifice, decided by the hardest equation a commander could ever face. After the purge, as it came to be called, a deep, chilling quiet settled over the Anka. The lockdown was lifted, but the ship felt emptier. We knew nearly 1/10 of our population was gone, sealed away in sectors that were now silent tombs. There were no memorials this time. The grief was too raw, the guilt too pervasive. We simply went back to our duties, our movements mechanical, our faces grim. We avoided eye contact, afraid to see the reflection of our own survival in the eyes of someone who had lost a friend, a spouse, a child. We were alive, but the cost of that life felt impossibly high. The hum of the ship now sounded like a funeral dirge. It was during this dark time that Mars began to change. For months, it had been just another bright point of light in the starfield, a destination that felt more theoretical than real. But now, it was visibly a world. Through the viewports, we could see it resolve from a red star into a small rust-colored disk. We could make out the white of the polar ice caps and the faint, dark smudges of canyons and craters. It was no longer an abstract concept, it was a place, a real solid world waiting for us. The sight of it began to slowly, painstakingly, cut through the fog of our grief. It was the promise, the reason for all the loss and suffering. Commander Rostova ordered the ship's telescopes to be linked to the main screens in the mess halls and common areas. 24 hours a day, we had a live, high-magnification view of our new home. We saw the towering peak of Olympus Mons, the scar of Valles Marineris. We watched dust storms, vast and pale, sweep across the ochre plains. We gave the features our own names, pointing them out to each other. "Look, the dragon's tail," someone would say, pointing to a winding canyon system. "That crater looks like Rostova's scowl," another would joke, a rare moment of levity. The planet started to become familiar, its geography imprinted on our minds. The approach was a slow, deliberate process. The Anka's main drive fell silent, and we began a long, graceful series of braking burns, shedding velocity as we spiraled closer and closer. The red disk grew, filling the viewports until it was no longer a world we were looking at, but a landscape. We could see mountains and plains, shadows and light. It was terrifying and magnificent. It was not Earth. There was no blue, no green, no comforting white clouds. It was alien, stark, and deeply intimidating. But it was there. It was real. And it was our last best hope. The red star that had beckoned us across the void was about to become our home. The day of arrival was not a celebration. The mood on the Anka was thick with anxiety and a profound sense of trepidation. We had spent months traveling through the sterile, predictable environment of space. Now we had to commit to the descent, to throw ourselves at the mercy of a planet's gravity and atmosphere. The main ship, the Anka, would remain in orbit, a permanent station, and our only lifeline back to the technology that sustained us. The landing itself would be done in a fleet of smaller, purpose-built landers, the Seeds. Each seed carried 500 people and the core components of a habitat module. The landing was the single most dangerous part of the entire mission. I was assigned to Seed 7, under the direct command of Rostova herself. We strapped ourselves into the acceleration couches, the harnesses digging into our shoulders. The silence inside the lander was absolute, a stark contrast to the constant hum of the Anka we had grown so accustomed to. We could only hear our own breathing, amplified in our helmets. Then came a series of loud mechanical clunks as the docking clamps released. A sudden jolt, and we were free. Through the small, reinforced viewport, I saw the massive form of the Anka recede above us. We were a tiny pod, a seed falling towards a vast red desert. The point of no return had passed. The entry into the thin Martian atmosphere was violent. The lander shuddered, every bolt and rivet groaning in protest as friction began to build. A faint orange glow appeared outside the viewport, quickly intensifying into a roaring inferno of superheated plasma. We were encased in fire, plummeting towards the ground. The deceleration G-forces pressed us deep into our seats, making it hard to breathe. Alarms blared on the console. Rostova's voice cut through the noise, calm and measured, calling out altitudes and velocities. There was no cheering, no sense of triumph. This was not a heroic moment from an old movie. It was a controlled crash, a brutal, terrifying fight against gravity. After what felt like an eternity, the main parachutes deployed with a gut-wrenching lurch. The fiery glow subsided, and the violent shaking was replaced by a swaying motion. Through the window, the Martian landscape rushed up to meet us. It was a panorama of red rocks and dust, utterly barren and hostile. It was a world without a single trace of life. The final seconds were a blur of retro-rocket firings, kicking up a huge cloud of red dust that obscured our view completely. Then, with a final solid thud that jarred our teeth, we were down. The engines cut out, the swaying stopped, and an entirely new kind of silence fell, the silence of another world. The moments after landing were surreal. The dust kicked up by our engines slowly settled, revealing a desolate alien vista outside the viewport. It was real. We were sitting on the surface of Mars. For a full 10 minutes, no one moved or spoke. We just sat strapped in our couches, listening. But there was nothing to hear. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic. Only the faint electronic hum of the lander's internal systems and the sound of our own ragged breathing inside our helmets. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the weight of a dead planet and the crushing vastness of the one we now inhabited. It was the sound of utter isolation. Commander Rostova was chosen to be the first to step outside. It was a symbolic and practical necessity. She unstrapped herself, her movements slow and deliberate in the bulky EVA suit. She moved to the airlock, the cycling of the pumps the only sound in the universe. We watched on the internal monitors as the outer hatch hissed open, revealing a landscape bathed in the eerie, pinkish light of the Martian sky. The camera on her helmet gave us her point of view, the metal ladder, the textured ground, and the impossibly vast empty horizon. This wasn't a victory lap, it was a scout stepping into hostile territory. She descended the ladder, each rung a deliberate heavy motion. Her boots touched the fine red soil. "Commander Rostova, status?" the comms officer asked, his voice tight. A pause stretched for an eternity. Then her voice came over the link, not triumphant but hushed, almost reverent. "I'm on the surface. The ground is soft. Fine. Like powder." She took a step. Then another. The only sound was the crunch of her boots in the regolith and the gentle hiss of her suit's life support. "The silence," she murmured, more to herself than to us. "It's so complete." In that moment, we all felt it. We were intruders here. Our every breath was an act of artificial defiance against a world that was not made for us. I looked around at the faces of my fellow passengers inside the lander. There were no smiles, no tears of joy. Just wide, stunned eyes reflecting the red desert outside. We had made it. We had crossed the void. We had survived the plague, the journey, the descent. But this was not the end. It was the first second of a new, terrifying beginning. We had traded a dying home for a dead one, and the struggle for survival was only just starting. Rostova's lone figure, a tiny white speck on a vast red canvas, was the sum of all our fears and all our hopes. We were alone, at the edge of everything, with only the silence and an unknown future ahead.